Hello everyone. In this video, we will be discussing the single sign-on feature in Cortex XDR. During this session, we will cover prerequisites, configuration of Cortex XDR SSO with Azure AD as the primary identity provider, and group mapping. Starting with Cortex XDR 3.4, XDR administrators can set up their Cortex XDR instances to use their organization's IDP for SAML-based single sign-on. Users of the XDR instance will then have the ability to easily log in using their organization's SSO process to access the console. It is important to note that all Cortex XDR users and administrators will still have the option to use their customer support portal credentials to log in. Also, SSO is only configured at the Cortex XDR instance level, meaning that it cannot be used for the Cortex gateway, and configuration is not shared between multiple tenants. Before you proceed with SSO configuration, you should ensure that you have the ability to log in as either an XDR account admin or instance administrator to the tenant you want to configure. This video also assumes that you are using Azure AD as your identity provider. However, you can use the concepts discussed here for other IDPs, but some specific items may be different. Start by logging into your Cortex XDR instance using your CSP credentials with an account that has either XDR account admin or instance administrator role. Turn on single sign-on by going to Settings, Configurations, scrolling to the bottom, and clicking single sign-on. Enable this toggle to see your options. Next, log in to your Azure portal, go to Azure AD, then click on the Enterprise Applications blade, and click New Application to get started creating your application. Select Integrate any other application you don't find in the gallery, non-gallery application, and give your application a name. When your application is provisioned, go to Single Sign-On and start by editing the basic SAML configuration. You will need the values displayed in your Cortex XDR console for single sign-on URL and audience URI. Set your identifier to your audience URI and the reply URL to your single sign-on URL. Also provide this sign-on URL under the sign-on URL optional field. Next, click Edit on your attributes and claims. You will see several URLs displayed for different fields, including user.mail, user.givenname, and others. Make note of these URLs for configuring your Cortex XDR console. Finally, download the certificate from Azure AD and also make note of the URLs shown in the box for Setup Cortex XDR. You will need your login URL and the Azure AD identifier URL. Next, in your Cortex XDR configuration, paste your IDP SSO URL from the Azure AD application and also the IDP issuer ID. This is your Azure AD application identifier. Then complete the IDP attributes mapping. You will need to paste the URLs that you observed in Azure AD. Please note these URLs are case sensitive and may cause issues if not properly entered. Click Save when you've completed this. Finally, you will need to open the certificate file that you downloaded and copy and paste the base64 text into this box and click Save. Now we're ready to test our integration. If you haven't already, ensure that you have assigned yourself to the Azure AD application we just created. Navigate to your XDR instance login page and observe that you now have the option to sign in with SSO. Go ahead and click on this link and log in with your Azure AD to test. A more advanced SSO use case is automatic role assignment, such that when a user is added to a group in Azure AD, the user will automatically receive a role in Cortex XDR based on that group membership. No additional work is required by the Cortex XDR administrator. This can be accomplished by performing group mapping. In Cortex XDR, create a user group by going to Settings, Configurations, and then clicking on User Groups, and then New Group. Enter a name for your new group, select a role, and then you will need to enter the group GUID from Azure AD. You can find your group GUID by going to Azure AD and selecting the Groups blade. Beside your group, you will see an object ID. This is the value you will need to copy and paste into the Saml group mapping. Once this is done, ensure that you have enabled group mapping in your SSO configuration by adding the group claim to your Azure AD configuration. Select the single sign-on blade and click Edit beside Attributes and Claims. Click Add a Group Claim. Select the group association you want to send, for example, security groups. Leave source attribute group ID selected, and optionally filter the groups if you only want to send selected groups. Click Save, and the group claim will be added. Notice that this has a new URL that you will need to provide. In Cortex XDR, go to Single Sign-On and paste the group claim URL under the group membership mapping field. Test and verify that assigning a user to a group in Azure AD results in that user receiving the appropriate role in Cortex XDR. Because user roles are not assigned directly within the Cortex XDR console, changing a user's role is as simple as moving them to another group within Azure AD that is mapped in Cortex XDR. Changes will take effect the next time the user logs in. A variety of problems can occur when configuring SAML-based single sign-on. Here are a few things to check. First, verify your email address in Azure AD matches your email address in Cortex XDR for existing users. Second, verify a role is being assigned if this is a new user, either via the default role in the Cortex XDR SSO configuration or via group mapping. If you are using group mapping to assign roles, verify the group ID in Azure AD matches the SAML group mapping in Cortex XDR. Verify the complete and correct URLs have been used in each configuration option, both in Cortex XDR and Azure AD. Single sign-on is a powerful way to reduce the number of credentials users are required to maintain while also being able to implement the multi-factor authentication mechanisms of your choice to guard against potential credential compromises. With this new capability, organizations can reduce the complexity of provisioning access to Cortex XDR console while also simplifying the user login experience. Thanks, and have a wonderful day.